We've had time to reflect on the Pan-African Parliament debacle that played out on our shores. It might have happened earlier in the week, but the ramifications will continue for some time. The Parliament is supposed to promote unity and the African agenda, but we saw just the opposite as members voted for a leadership platform. We heard threats of violence, witnessed pandemonium. If the continent's leaders cannot speak with one voice, what hope is there of kickstarting the African century? Let's speak to political economist Mantle Isaacs about what this means for us. Before we get on to that, it's good to have you with us tonight. We lost you last night because of the unacceptable blackouts that we see in our country. Also unacceptable, that pandemonium that we saw with the Pan-African Parliament and leaders there all, scrambling to get at each other's throats. If we can't even get that right there, what does this mean for the African continent?
Well, good evening, Jane. It's extremely unfortunate to see what we've seen from the Pan-African Parliament this week. As an institution, it's already sort of battling for relevance. I think about 17 years into its existence, of all the kind of AU structures, this is the one that is supposed to, represent the voice of the 1.4 billion African people. And from what we've seen, it's been largely a irrelevant institution. I don't think many of us think about it on our day-to-day lives. And that's because it is in theory, a parliament, but it's a parliament that doesn't make laws that are binding on African states. We do not directly elect its parliamentarians. So it's at best a talk shop, and from what we've seen this week, it's not even a civil and kind of unified or coherent talk shop at that. So I think it really brings into relief how much farther we have to go as Africans in terms of our continental institutions actually catalyzing our development.
I mean, the irony of this is that it's supposed to bring unity and push for Africa becoming more relevant on the world stage, and we saw anything but unity there. I mean, where does this leave what you talk about, the African century?
Well, I think if we're honest, the African agenda is somewhat adrift. I mean, it's a thing that obviously our leaders like to talk about. I mean, there's no African leader who's ever going to say, not say that unity is important, that we unite as a continent, but it's got to move beyond platitudes. We had the initial kind of Pan-Africanist generation of Kwame Nkrumah and Emperor Selassie, and those kind of giants who really were committed to African unity. And, the first iteration of the OAU actually achieved its mission of liberating the African continent from colonialism. We saw a rebirth in the first decade of the century with, Thabo Mbeki and some of his peers, President Obasanjo and President Wade from Senegal, and those leaders who seemed quite committed to African Renaissance. But the AU over the past 2 decades and the Pan-African Parliament being one of its institutions have really failed to move the needle on some of our biggest challenges in terms of peace and security, inclusive economic development, and as well as entrenching democracy and governance, as we've seen leaders across the continent continue to try to hang on in office, continue to steal elections, and we still see military coups in places like Mali. So it's really of concern to those of us who like to see this become the African century.
I mean, you talk about leaders and leadership. I mean, there we saw leaders, threatening each other with violence. I mean, when you've got leaders hanging on to power, it doesn't leave much space for the individual, the man, the woman on the street to develop, as you say, to push for more democracy.
Yes, if you look at some of our leading, nations in Africa. Africa, obviously 55 countries, 1.4 billion people, and you would like to see, countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, DRC, Kenya, some of these big economies and, large powers that kind of, as our countries go, so does the region go. You'd like to see those countries step up. But obviously, as we're seeing in South Africa and similar in Nigeria, we now seem to be at a stage where some of our leading African players are so beset by domestic and internal difficulties that the continental agenda, frankly, is somewhat adrift. We don't really see, leaders with stature and confidence to kind of lead continental initiatives. So I think the best we can hope for is that in the next couple of years, we consolidate our internal conditions such that our countries can achieve sort of stability and prosperity. And only then, I think, will you start to see these leaders come together. But, to your point, if we cannot, as a continent, speak with one voice, find each other, get over some of these divisions about West and East and North and South and Anglophone, Francophone, if we can't, cooperate towards a developed, coherent agenda, then we're going to continue to be on the periphery of global affairs.
And Mantla, I mean, many of these domestic issues are stirred and exacerbated by outside forces. When you've got these redundant bodies, the AU, the Arab League, SADC, I mean, it doesn't bode well to resolve these issues. How can this money be better spent?
Well, I think that we really need to, the AU and even our regional institutions, frankly, these kind of top-down, everybody's part of the club, even if we have different values, different norms of governance, I think these institutions are not really going to be that effective. Ultimately, you need the leading players to step up. When you talk about the European Union, you cannot talk about the European Union without talking about France and Germany and their commitment to the project and the extent to which they find one another on issues. Not to say that other countries don't matter, but South Africa and Nigeria, as I say, we are the giants of Africa, and if we are not able to get our own internal houses in order in terms of having countries that are stable, that allow us to then have those regional ambitions, and they're not able to cooperate, we're going to be in trouble. So we really have our work cut out for us.
Oh, we sure do. Thanks very much for that, Mantla Isaacs.